Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Beards Without Borders. This is the Ernest Hemingway edition. Tonight we're going to be doing a reading from Ernest Hemingway, a incredible explorer, writer, warrior, life lover, and then eventually a tragedy. Smoking the Savinelli churchwarden pipe. Love this. Smokes flawlessly. Absolute flawless. Lit it initially with a torch. I always have I have everything nearby. Zippo. Weird Beard Bic lighter. I use all three. I have wooden matches here. Splints, candles. I have a brass Zippo vintage that I love. This is an oldie but goodie. Beautiful, beautiful pipe. Love it. I've yet to find a great insert for those pipes that really, really works. If you have any suggestions, let me know. Okay. This is the vintage Rolling Thunder. Can you see that? Rolling Thunder. I love it. Holding the beer together is a corn cob. Cut up a corn cob today. A pipe. Kind of modifying something. Took the top off. Makes a great beard ring. Kind of keeps it out of the way. So, there you go. There's a use for a corn cob pipe right there. All right, let's get started on the story. It's a short story written in 1923 by Ernest Hemingway. This is called Up in Michigan. You might like this. The reason why I read stories to you is that reading expands the mind, and I hope I inspire you to read. I've spent most of my life reading extensively. I have a very, very large library of classics, and I'm constantly reading. And the biggest downfall of being online is that you're reading temporary stuff on your computer or your laptop or your tablet and not the classics. I love having a book in my hand. So let me read you a classic from 1923 from one of the greatest authors that ever lived in the United States, Ernest Hemingway. John Gilmore came from Horton's Bay in Canada. He bought the blacksmith shop from Old Man Horton. Jim was short and dark with a big mustache and big hands. He was a good horseshoer and did not look much like a blacksmith, even with his leather apron on. He lived upstairs above the blacksmith shop and took his meals at A.J. Smith's. Liz Coates worked for Smith's. Mrs. Smith, who was a very large, clean woman, said Liz Coates was the neatest girl she ever seen. Liz had good legs and always wore clean gingham aprons, and Jim noticed that her hair was always neat. He liked her face because it was so jolly, but he never thought about her. Liz liked Jim very much. She liked the way he walked over from the shop and often went to the kitchen door to watch for him to start down the road. She liked it about his mustache. She liked it about how white his teeth were when he smiled. She liked it very much that he didn't look like a blacksmith. She liked it how A.J. Smith and Mrs. Smith liked Jim. One day she found that she liked it the way the hair was black on his arms and how white they were above the tanned line when he washed up in the wash basin outside the house. Liking that made her feel funny. Horton's Bay, the town, was only 5 houses on the main road between Boyne City and Charlevoix. There was the general store and post office with a high false front and maybe a wagon hitched out in front Smith's house, Stroud's house, Fox's house, Horton's house, and Van Hoosen's house. The houses were in a big grove of elm trees, and the road was very sandy. There was farming country and timber each way up the road. Up the road a ways was the Methodist church, and down the road in the other direction was the township school. The blacksmith shop was painted red and faced the school. A steep sandy road ran down the hill to the bay through the timber. From Smith's back door you could look out across the woods that ran down to the lake across the bay. It was very beautiful in the spring and summer. The sky blue and bright, and usually whitecaps on the lake beyond the point from the breeze blowing in from Charlevoix and Lake Michigan. From Smith's back door, Liz could see ore barges way out in the lake going towards Boyne City. When she looked at them, they didn't seem to be moving at all. But if she went in and dried some more dishes, then came out again, they would be out of sight beyond the point. Kind of like a beard. When you're staring at it, when you're focusing on it, you don't realize that it's growing. A lot of people write me and say, my beard stopped growing. I go, stop thinking about it and go about your daily business. All the time Liz was thinking about Jim Gilmore. He didn't seem to notice her very much. He talked about the shop to A.J. Smith and about the Republican Party and about James G. Blaine. In the evenings he read the Toledo Blade and the Grand Rapids paper by the lamp. In the front room, or went out spearing fish in the bay with a jacklight with A.J. Smith. A jacklight? What is a jacklight? I have to look that up now. Do you know what a jacklight is? In the fall, he and Smith and Charlie Wyman took a wagon and tent, grubs, axes, their rifles, and 2 dogs and went on a trip to the Pine Plains beyond Vanderbilt, deer hunting. Liz and Mrs. Smith were cooking for 4 days for them before they started. Liz wanted to make something special for Jim to take, but she didn't finally because she was afraid to ask Mrs. Smith for the eggs and flour, and afraid if she bought them, Mrs. Smith would catch her cooking. It would have been all night with Mrs. Smith, but Liz was afraid. All the time Jim was gone on a deer hunting trip, Liz thought about him. It was awful while he was gone. She couldn't sleep well from thinking about him, but she discovered it was fun to think about him too. If she let herself go, it was better. The night before they were to come back, she didn't sleep at all because it was all mixed up in a dream about not sleeping and really not sleeping. When she saw the wagon coming down the road, she felt weak and sick sort of inside. She couldn't wait till she saw Jim, and it seemed as though everything would be all right when he came. The wagon stopped outside the big elm, and Mrs. Smith and Liz went out. All the men had beards, and there were 3 deer in the back of the wagon, their thin legs sticking stiff over the edge of the wagon box. Mrs. Smith kissed Alonzo when he hugged her. Jim said, "Hello, Liz," and grinned. Liz hadn't known what would happen when Jim got back, but she was sure it would be something. Nothing happened. Expectations, right? The men were just home, that was all. Jim pulled the burlap sack off the deer, and Liz looked at them. One was a big buck. It was stiff and hard to lift out of the wagon. "Did you shoot it?" Liz asked. "Yeah, ain't it a beauty?" Jim got it onto his back to carry it to the smokehouse. That night, Charlie Wyman stayed to supper at Smith's. It was too late to get back to Charlevoix. The men washed up and waited in the front room for supper. "Ain't there something left in that crock, Jimmy?" A.J. Smith asked, and Jim went out to the wagon in the barn and fetched in the jug of whiskey the men had taken with them. It was a 4-gallon jug, and there was quite a little slopped back and forth in the bottom. Jim took a long pull on his way back to the house. It was hard to lift such a big jug up to drink out of it. Some of the whiskey ran down his shirt. The 2 men smiled when Jim came in with the jug. A.J. Smith sent for glasses, and Liz brought them. A.J. poured out 3 big shots. Well, here's looking at you, A.J., said Charlie Wyman. That damn big buck, Jimmy, said A.J. Here's all the ones we missed, A.J., said Jim, and they all downed their liquor. Tastes good to a man. Nothing like it this time of year for what ails you. How about another, boys? Here's how, A.J. Down the creek. Here's to next year. Jim began to feel great. He loved the taste and the feel of whiskey. He was glad to be back to a comfortable bed and warm food in the shop. He had another drink. The men came in to supper feeling hilarious but acting very respectable. Liz sat at the table after she put on the food and ate with the family. It was a good dinner. The men ate seriously. After supper, they went into the front room again and Liz cleaned up with Mrs. Smith. Then Mrs. Smith went upstairs, and pretty soon Smith came out and went upstairs too. Jim and Charlie were still in the front room. Liz was sitting in the kitchen next to the stove pretending to read a book and thinking about Jim. She didn't want to go to bed, yet because she knew Jim would be coming out, and she wanted to see him as he went out so she could take the way he looked up to bed with her. Well, that's kind of nice, isn't it? To have a woman look at you because she wants the way you look to be on her mind when she goes to bed. A lot of guys do that too. We think about the women that we love, and we want that to be the last thing on our minds as we drift off to sleep. She was thinking about him hard, and then Jim came out. His eyes were shining and his hair was a little bit rumpled. Liz looked down at her book. Jim came over, back of her chair, stood there. She could feel him breathing. Then he put his arms around her. Her breasts felt plump and firm under his hands. Liz was terribly frightened. No one ever touched her, but she thought, he's come to me finally. He's really come here. She held herself stiff because she was so frightened and did not know anything else to do. And then Jim held her tight against the chair and kissed her. It was a sharp, aching, hurting feeling that she thought she couldn't stand it. She felt Jim right through the back of the chair, and she couldn't stand it. And then something clicked inside of her, and the feeling was warmer and softer. Jim held her tight against the chair, and she wanted it now, and Jim whispered, "Come on for a walk." Liz took her coat off the peg on the kitchen wall, and they went out the door. Jim had his arm around her. Every little way they stopped and pressed against each other, and Jim kissed her. There was no moon, and they walked ankle deep in the sandy road through the trees, down to the dock and the warehouse on the bay. The water was lapping in the piles, and the point was dark across the bay. It was cold, but Liz was hot all over, because she was with Jim. They sat down in the shelter of the warehouse, and Jim pulled Liz close to him. She was frightened. One of Jim's hands went inside her dress and stroked over her breast, and the other hand was in her lap. She was really frightened and didn't know how he was going to go about things, but she did snuggle close to him. Then the hand that felt so big in her lap went away and was on her leg and started to move up it. "Don't, Jim," she said. Jim slid the hand further up. "You mustn't, Jim, you mustn't." Neither Jim nor Jim's big hand paid any attention to her. The boards were hard. Jim had her dress up and was trying to do something to her. She was frightened, but she also wanted it. She had to have it, but it frightened her. "You mustn't do it, Jim, you mustn't." "I've got to. I'm going to. You know we have to," Jim said. "No, we haven't, Jim. We don't have to do that. We ain't got to. It isn't right." "Oh, Jim, you can't. Jim." The hemlock planks of the dock were hard and splintery and cold, and Jim was heavy on her, and he had hurt her. Liz pushed him. She was so uncomfortable and cramped. Jim was asleep. He wouldn't move. She worked out from under him and sat up and straightened her skirt and coat and tried to do something with her hair. Jim was sleeping with his mouth a little bit open. Liz leaned over and she kissed him. He was still asleep. She lifted his head, and she shook it. He rolled his head over and swallowed. Liz started to cry. She walked over to the edge of the dock and looked down to the water. There was a mist coming up from the bay. She was cold and miserable from everything that she experienced, and everything felt gone. She walked back to where Jim was lying and shook him once more, just to make sure. She was crying. "Jim," she said, "Jim, please, Jim." Jim stirred and curled a little tighter. Liz took off her coat and leaned over, covered him with it. She tucked it around him neatly and carefully. Then she walked across the dock and up the steep sandy road to go to bed. A cold mist was coming up through the woods from the bay. Jim and Liz. 1923, Ernest Hemingway. Interesting, huh? Knowing Ernest Hemingway the way that I do, from reading all of his works and his biography, I am willing to bet that that was a biographical story. Embellished a little bit, but I'm willing to bet that that was something that he experienced. It's 33 degrees outside right now. It's probably 45 degrees in this Van Gogh room right now. The propane heater is going behind the camera. I've got 2 oil lamps on, giving off heat. When I tell you these things give off heat, I'm not kidding. I mean, if I didn't have like these little pie tins, they're nice because they illuminate everything below, but they're catching heat. Otherwise, that heat would just go up to the roof, and I can actually feel the heat from this. Who is your favorite author? Who do you like to read? Have you wanted to get back into reading again? Whether it be just a simple paperback book or a musty smelling old hardcover book. Books are beautiful. I challenge you to start reading again. If you don't have any books, go to a store, go to a thrift store. You can buy books for $1, $2, $3. Something interesting. For many years, I just read nonfiction, business, how-to. And then because I felt fiction was a waste of time. And then I discovered fiction again, rediscovered it, and got into Dickens, Shakespeare, Faulkner, Hemingway, Edgar Allan Poe, reading everything by C.S. Lewis. And if there were any movies that were made out of those stories, I usually either rented it, back in the days when you would rent movies, or I would find them on demand. This is called a churchwarden pipe. And a churchwarden is a guy that protected a church at night because there were valuables in a church. And it's said that he could smoke his pipe while sitting down not quite reclining, but just kind of leaning back and smoking and still having his eyes on what he was protecting. He was a security guard, church warden. And he didn't have to take his eyes off of what he was protecting when he lit it. When you have a small pipe, let me show you. Let's just say the average small pipe. You got to look at the flame and your eye like this. See, my eyes are only on here, but they're not out and about. When I have a church warden pipe, my eyes are still able to see everything that's in front of me. What type of arts are you into? What do you have? Are you a painter? Do you make pipes? Do you make things? Do you putter around in a workshop or a garage? Do you whittle wood? Do you have a jackknife? Do you sculpt clay? Do you make anything? Jewelry? Do you have model trains, airplanes? I encourage you to get back to the things that give you pleasure, to take your mind off daily events, stresses. Stress will kill you. You know that, don't you? These are nice to hold on to. A lot of times when the bowl gets too hot, you just kind of hold the shank area like that. But they're not meant to clench. In other words, I'm not meant to let go of this. Now watch. I can feel the weight of that in my mouth. And I don't want that weight. I don't want it hanging on my teeth like that. It's too heavy for that. That's why my elbow is planted on the table and I just swing it over to my mouth and take a puff. You might have seen the video where I was working on a small pipe today. I took a Missouri Meerschaum Mark Twain pipe and fiddled around with it. I still have to mess with it. Can you see that? Made a poker out of it. I want to put a band on it. It's got a saddle bit, stained it. I want to scuff it up a little bit. These Missouri Meerschaums are nice, but this particular model, they get chipped around this very easily. So it's not my favorite. So you don't have to work really hard to make it rustic looking because it is just by nature. Just even the slightest tap on something or it falls over, whatever. But I can't wait to fire that up. And when I finish this is only day one with it. When I finish it, I'm going to show it to you. The next time you see it, it's going to be completely finished, and we'll do a Beards Without Borders episode. I'm meeting tomorrow morning with the owner of the cigar shop, where we're going to be doing some Beards Without Borders broadcasts and doing some pipe talk as well, and guy talk, and maybe I'll have a co-host. I don't know. We'll see. This pipe is almost done. I didn't get a chance to pour my spirits, but I'm going to do that right now. A little Don Julio. And the square shot glass. Maybe a third. There we go, like that. I usually toast you. That comes from reclining too much while drinking. And I actually need to sit forward more. I find that when I'm kind of like, you can't see my angle, but I'm like leaning back quite a bit right now. And building up my voice again because I've done several videos. If you're not using your voice on a regular basis for singing or doing voiceover work, it's like a muscle. You have to get yourself back into it. So that's one of the reasons why I read out loud, is to get my chops back, because I'm getting back into this whole commercial acting and modeling world again as a bearded man. Since literally past couple years it dried up, since I decided that this is my image, it's not going away. The phone calls actually stopped. My phone actually stopped ringing. And I haven't even had an audition in a year. So now that I have a big white beard, I have to rethink my strategy and reinvent myself. And that can happen. Anyways, Don Julio, probably one of my favorite tequilas. I want to toast you and thank you for hanging in there with me. Sip it in the square shot glass. Oh, that is so beautiful. I like this better than Patron. Patron was my initiation. That's how I first got into tequila, was through Patron, which was good. It's a good starter. And then I just kind of moved up, and I like this. Oh, I can taste the earth. I can taste the earth in that. Very, very green, very earthy tequila is. Well, my friends, it's the end of another episode. And wherever you are in the world, I hear traffic right now. You might be hearing animals, crickets, waves crashing. You might be hearing gunfire or bombs. This is broadcast all over the world. Peace never makes headlines, but war always does. Conflict and chaos always makes the headlines. But peace, comfort, and calm never does. You'll never wake up to see the headlines. Everything was peaceful and comfortable overnight. But I assure you that on Beards Without Borders, peace is always the headline here. I'll see you again soon. I bid you peace and pipes. Good night.